If you feel like the last 3 years have been hectic, chaotic, and all kinds of unpredictable, you're not alone. Since the beginning of the decade, countries in every corner of the world have experienced the rug of relative stability pulled out from under their feet, and Canada is no exception. From lockdowns, raucous protests, and nationwide convoys, to skyrocketing inflation and a cross-country housing crisis, anxiety and unrest seem the new norm. Sweeping gun bans introduced by the Liberals that threaten law-abiding property owners and sustenance hunters alike are a cherry on top of the maelstrom. But with the new year comes new zeal for many taking a stand against Bill C-21. Keep watching to learn more about the bill that could ban a record number of firearms in Canada and what people like you are doing to fight it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you enjoy the video. New gun control legislation in Canada is triggering cross-country debate on public safety, property rights, and federal government overreach.
A new government proposal would make more firearms illegal.
The Liberals tabled new firearms legislation, calling it the strongest in a generation.
A ban of assault-style weapons and attachments was put forward by the Canadian government in 2020 and recently updated to include 1,500 models of firearms. In October 2022, the federal government also implemented Bill C-21, a freeze on the transfer and sale of handguns.
What do we want? Gun control! Where do we want it? Now!
Gun control advocates insist rigid firearms laws will prevent mass casualty events, like the 2020 Portapique tragedy in Nova Scotia, which resulted in 22 deaths. But supporters of firearm use and possession in Canada argue the new legislation will not reduce gun crime or increase public safety.
Gun control has never worked in Canada. No form of gun control that has been tried has ever worked. Governments always bring forth gun control, and this is particularly the case here, stating that there's some presumed relationship between gun control and crime reduction. Actually, that particular connection has never been proven by any study that I looked at, certainly not in Canada. And in fact, there are some situations where gun controls have been introduced, and it has had the opposite effect. We've actually seen an increase in crime. That not only speaks to the fact that gun control does not have any impact upon crime because criminals don't use legal firearms.
Rod Giltaca is a part of the Mass Casualty Commission, the leading body of the public inquiry into the mass shooting event in Nova Scotia. On September 22nd, he voiced his findings on the impact gun legislation did have or could have had on the tragic event.
The only regulation that could have had any influence on this tragedy is found in Section 117 of the Criminal Code. And that regulation, as it is today, was more than sufficient to serve its intended purpose. So in plain language, Section 117 allows a peace officer to apply to a court for a search warrant, or in some cases search without a warrant with the intent to seize firearms or weapons or other prohibited devices in the interest of public safety. The Section 117 powers were the only applicable laws that may have possibly made a difference. It seems they weren't used. Now, on the contrary, every other firearm regulation in Canada had absolutely no effect in mitigating or preventing this tragedy. Not a single one. Not magazine size restrictions, not possession offenses, storage, transportation regulations, certainly not any Australian-style gun buybacks, or the innumerable prohibitions that we've seen before or after the mass casualty event. Not a single law could have had any influence on what happened. If all firearms were banned in Canada for the last 100 years, I've said this before, this tragedy would have happened exactly the same way.
In late September, Alberta Justice Minister Tyler Shandro announced that Alberta RCMP would be directed to refrain from confiscating prohibited guns initially banned in 2020 and included in the new amendments to Bill C-21.
We are also pursuing legal action. Alberta will seek to intervene in 6 ongoing judicial review applications challenging the constitutionality of the federal firearm prohibition legislation. As interveners, we would be able to offer the court arguments based on the specific challenges that the federal legislation has created for Alberta's law-abiding firearms community and advance legal arguments that the federal government has overreached with its plan to ban 1,500 models of firearms.
Saskatchewan recently proposed its own Firearms Act. It requires federal agents to be licensed by the CFO of the province before removing any weapons, and fair compensation for any gun confiscated. Manitoba and New Brunswick officials have also spoken out against the ban, saying no provincial resources will be put towards confiscating legally owned guns. The Yukon government went a step further and passed a motion in territorial legislation to the same effect. And the provinces aren't the only ones taking a stand against the bill.
Therefore, be it resolved that the First Nations in Assembly, 1, publicly opposed to Bill C-21.
On December 8th, the Special Chiefs Assembly at the annual AFN passed an emergency resolution to signify a unified stand against the gun ban.
Call upon the Government of Canada to conduct proper and adequate consultation with First Nations as is required under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, prior to enacting laws that impact First Nation inherent constitutional and treaty rights to hunt and harvest.
I was reminded by my elders and my hunter-gatherers, people in my community that this was an important issue to them.
You know, our people always lived off the land, and that's how we survived, how we're surviving now. We continue to practice our traditional activities. Is supporting our families and teaching our young ones and people to be able to protect the land and also use the land properly.
The resolution followed amendments proposed on December 1st that would include hunting firearms in the sweeping ban. Trudeau assured the amendments would be reviewed and the controversial changes were withdrawn from the bill on February 3rd. But gun advocate Rob Boutlier says Canadians shouldn't view the government's concession as a win.
When you're negotiating, you never come in expecting to get the whole deal that you're asking for, right? So this is the game they play. The thing is that they're not trying to make anybody safer. They're trying to shovel as many firearms into the bin of illegal firearms as humanly possible. So when you look at Bill C-21, everybody says, this is so dumb, it doesn't make sense. Well, it makes perfect sense. This is their massive grab to see how much stuff they can take. And they're getting pushback. But if they even gain an inch with Bill C-21, they won. Because now everybody is begging for the government to not ban hunting rifles. That's the conversation they've created. They went from putting everything, including the kitchen sink, on that list of things that they're banning. They create public outrage because of what's on the list. And then they come out and they put on an act where they say, well, we're going to review it now, and we're only going to have half as many firearms on that new ban list. And everybody says, whew, we get to keep our hunting rifles. And then they go back and they've banned as many rifles as they wanted to at that point in time. By coming to the table and holding a conversation with them and entertaining these bills, they've already won. For me, the balance is, the more you restrict firearms, the more bold government becomes and the more risk you create within society. And when you weigh the cost benefit of disarming a society versus what the outcome could possibly be, there's no payoff to any restrictions on firearms ownership whatsoever.
Bill C-21 is still under consideration in the House of Commons, with the reporting stage and third reading to be completed. The next meetings on the bill will focus on the effects of the withdrawals, featuring witness testimony from experts to determine whether alternative amendments will be proposed.